today's video, I want to talk about different ways of arranging the triads. Now that we're familiar with our basic shape of the triad, its simplest form in root position, we're going to learn about some of the other positions that the triad can find itself in. And this is going to relate very closely to what we had for intervals and interval inversions, but now with 3 notes. So let's get into it. The piece at the very beginning was Clara Schumann's Nocturne from her piece Soirée Musicale, which was published in, I think, 1836. And this was works of romantic piano music that is very warm and very nice. This shuffles through a few chords right here at the beginning, and we're going to get a chance to review some of the triads that we find here and also look at some other pieces as well. Triads in music, just to review, are some of the most fundamental shapes that show up completely constantly in a variety of genres. And so they're very important to recognize. And we learned last time how we can have major and minor and augmented and diminished triads, that triads in their basic forms are stacked thirds, and that we can supply them with names, such as, for this one, C major. And we can also, in the key of C major, call this the 1 chord or the tonic chord, and we can label that with Roman numeral 1, as you see there. So this is just by way of review, but let's take a look at some other possible arrangements of these notes. If we think on the keyboard, we have C, E, G here, and that forms the basic shape of our triad. But thinking back to our interval inversions, how we took the bottom note and moved it up an octave, or took the top note and moved it down an octave, what if we started applying these kinds of transformations to this chord, to this basic shape? What will happen? So C, E, G becomes, C goes up an octave to here, becomes E, G, C. Okay, so that's one arrangement. We have C, E, G, then E, G, C. Then what about another arrangement? If we take the E up the octave and put it here, then we have G, C, E. So that's another new arrangement. So far we've got and. Okay, and then if we take the G and move it up the octave, then we're left with these, C, E, G. So that actually is returning to the basic shape that we started with. Now, if we look at these on the staff, they look something like this. And we call this first one, as we said, C major. That's our basic C major chord. What are we going to label these other chords? So as you can see here, we've got C, E, G, then E, G, C, then G, C, E. These are, of course, the same 3 notes. And they are all C major. They're all going to sound like C major. They all have that same quality of C rootedness and majorness. But now the C isn't always going to be the lowest note, isn't always going to be in the bass. As we see here, we've done the inversion process and taken the lowest note and moved it up the octave twice to get all the possible shapes that this chord can take. And the most important thing is what's in the bass. So in the first one, C is in the bass. So this is C major chord over bass note C. And that's going to be really important when we have like bass line moving and we have the C there. But then we can also have C major chord over bass note E. And that's going to be like our first inversion. And then the second inversion is like a C major chord with bass note G. So you can hear how those, especially when I apply the lower bass note and kind of spread them out a little bit, have a very specific kind of quality to them that is different. They all ring as C major, but they sound somewhat changed. And notice if I show you on the keyboard, notice that I'm playing the same chord here. Just the root position chord, but I'm changing the bass note. Root position. First inversion, C major over E in the bass. And second inversion, C major over G in the bass. So that's the basic essence of our inversion process there. Notice that if you keep going, if you bring, as we showed at the beginning, if you bring the G up an octave again, you'll actually just wrap back around to the root position triad. It'll be up the octave, but you've basically just closed the circle, as you can see with the line there showing G connecting back to G. And as I've been saying, we're going to call these root position when the root is in the bass. First inversion when the third is in the bass, and second inversion when the fifth is in the bass. Now, in Roman numerals, though, there is a whole separate language for this. Well, these are all the one chord in C major, as we can see here, but we use this terminology here: 1 for root position, 1/6 for first inversion, and 1/6/4 for second inversion. And so you might see this a lot. It's important to know. I want to explain these numbers to you and where they come from. So the 6 and the 6/4 emerge from a tradition called the figured bass. And we won't go into it terribly too much, but just so you know, figured bass are intervals in a chord that are measured up from the bass note. And as I said, with inversion, the bass note is the most important thing to pay attention to. In root position, the bass note is the root. In first inversion, the bass note is the third. In second inversion, the bass note is the fifth. As you can see, the figured bass, the figures that are next to the Roman numeral, in other words, the numbers that are next to the Roman numeral, will be the intervals measured up from the lowest note, the bass. And yeah, figures just mean numbers above the bass, figured bass. Once again, the bass is the lowest note, and that's the most important note for determining inversion. So when we look at the bass notes of these chords, as mentioned, we have C, E, and G there. Let's actually go about measuring these intervals from the lowest note. So C up to G will be one interval, and C up to E will be the other interval, to measure the root position chord intervals up from the lowest note. So what are the figures for this chord? Well, they're going to be 5 for the G, that's a perfect fifth, as we know, and 3 for the E, that's the major third. So C to E, that's a third, C to G, that's a fifth. We're just measuring up the intervals from the bass. Then if we go to the second inversion, we will get slightly different intervals. And so this is helping us to distinguish, are we in first inversion, second inversion, or root position? So in first inversion, we're going to have a 6 actually from E to C. Whereas in root position, as I say, we have a fifth and a third to make that chord measured up from the bass. Then in first inversion, we have a 6th from E to C, a minor 6th, but we'll just write the number 6. Just the size is important for inversion. We'll have a 6th and a third. So we're going to call first inversion 6, 3. Intervals measured up from the bass. And then the second inversion is going to have a 6th from G up to E. This time it's a major 6th, but we'll just note that it's a 6th. And then G up to C, which is a perfect 4th. So second inversion, as you might imagine, will be called 6/4. And these are our inversion numbers, but they look slightly different from what we saw before. So what explains that? Well, it's important to note that these are very often shorthanded or abbreviated, so that the 5/3 is just left out. Okay, we can recognize that this is already a root position triad. Everyone knows that has a fifth and a third, so no worries about it. The 5/3, we recognize that is just kind of the standard root position form. You don't need to write that. Now, to distinguish first inversion and second inversion, though, we do write 1. So we write 1/6 for first inversion. 1/6 just means that is the inversion of the chord that has a 6th from the bass note to the root. So the lowest note to C is measured here as a 6, so it's 1/6. And then in the 6/4, in the second inversion, to distinguish this further from the first inversion, we note that that is the inversion that has a 6th and a 4th. So that's the second inversion. And that is why when we shorthand them, they start to look like what we saw originally. 1, 1/6, and 1/6/4 for each inversion respectively. And notice that those bass notes C, E, and G are just like we talked about before. This is the C chord over C, this is the C chord over E, and this is the C chord over G. So hopefully that makes sense how that works, and you can imagine how you could apply that to any triad. But I want to double reinforce here. You can see that the root remains C the whole time. And this is a really important thing, actually, that these are just transformations of the same chord. They're just rotations or inversions of the one chord. The root is the same there, in this case C, as you can see in gold, in each inversion. Note that it's not always in the bass. Only in root position are the bass and the root the same note. In first inversion, the bass is E and the root is C. It's up there somewhere, a 1/6 away. And then in second inversion, the bass is G in this case, and the root is C, a 1/4 away. So that's the second inversion, 1/6/4 we would call that. So the root is not equal to the bass, except when in root position where you can find the root in the bass. This is actually really important because if you imagine finding in music a chord that's in some inversion, you might mentally or on paper reorganize that chord back into root position, put it in its simplest form, and that way you can determine the root quickly. After a while, you'll be able to recognize these shapes and say, hey, I know the root of that chord, even though it's in inversion. The root is somewhere in the middle there. It's not necessarily in the bass, because chords aren't always in root position. So this is really important to recognize that sometimes different notes can appear in the bass, change the inversion of the chord, and have a slightly different quality to them. So that is basically it with inversion of triads. There's only these two inversions. With 3 notes, we're only going to get 3 different basic shapes that they can arrange themselves in before they rotate back onto the first one. So let's take a look at a few of these in music, and shortly later this week we'll talk about more complicated things to do with bigger chords and inverting those. So back to that piece from the very beginning, Clara Schumann's Nocturno or Nocturne. This piece begins in F major, we can see from the key signature, and from the fact that it has a big F major chord at the beginning. Etc., etc. So I hope you can hear at the beginning there the way that the piece moves from chord to chord every 2 measures. So take a look at the first 2 measures. They're exactly the same. Then if we take a look at the 3rd and 4th measure, those 2 measures, I'm looking mostly just at the left hand here, just at the bass line where the chords are most clear, remembering that the melody often weaves in and out of the chords. In the left hand, 3rd and 4th measure, we have a new note that comes in. This chord looks almost exactly the same as the measure before, but there is one change. You notice that now there is C sharp. So now we have F, C sharp, A, and C sharp, and those are the notes that are ringing to make the chord now. So let's listen to the first chord again and how it transitions to the second chord. So hear how big a difference the C sharp makes when it comes in there. And so we'll talk about what that chord is. But then after that, in the 5th and 6th measure, we get a new chord, which is in an inversion. So let's take a look. First chord was this, F major. Then the second chord was this with C sharp. Then the third chord is this. So F is still in the bass. Then D now, and A, and D. That makes a new triad, F, A, and D. But it's not quite in its right shape. We can't quite make out what is, for example, the root of this chord is not F. F was the root of the first chord, F was the root of the second chord, but now, even though F is in the bass in the 3rd chord, that is not the root. Let's take a look at what this chords look like if I make a quick reduction. So here we can see a quick reduction where the first 2 measures are simply F, A, C, F major. And I've taken the bass note and left it in the bass where it is. Then I took the C and put it a 5th above. Then I took the A and just snuck it there in the middle. And I just compressed all of the notes that are sounding in the piece into its simplest form, an F major chord. And I've done that for measures 1 and 2. Now take a look at measures 3 and 4. As we saw, those are very similar, but now there is C sharp there. Something has been raised. The C is pushing upwards on its way to D, and then you see there the 3rd chord in measures 5 and 6 is F, A, and then there's a space, D. It doesn't quite look like a snowman. It doesn't quite look like a root position triad. So this is a chord that's in inversion. And if you don't remember exactly which inversion, don't worry, we'll talk about it in a second. Now, if we want to apply Roman numerals to this, well, we'll recognize that this piece has the key signature of F major and begins with an F major chord with F in the bass. That's a very good sign that we're in F major. Let's analyze it as though we're in F major. Then we'll get these chords. So the first 2 chords are just 1. That's the 1 chord. What is chords 3 and 4? We'll notice that this is now 2 major thirds, F to A and A to C sharp. In other words, F augmented. Now we have F augmented triad as it shows up in actual music. And here it is. Beautifully used in this piece, I would say. And if we remember our Roman numeral notation for augmented, we're just going to have the one chord there because it is the F triad, but now with a plus to show that it is augmented, that the fifth has been raised up away, and that is now 2 major thirds, making an augmented triad there. 1 plus means 1 augmented. You could have any number of Roman numerals have the plus on there that would indicate there's an augmented triad above that. Now for the third one, if we rearrange this chord so that it makes a snowman, we might take the bottom note up the octave or take the middle note up the octave, and we'd kind of be rotating that way a little bit, or we can recognize that this one can be made into its simplest form very quickly by just taking the D from the upper octave down the octave. So D, if it goes down there, now it looks like a triad. D, F, A is the chord that's sounding here. So this is a D chord. This chord is actually D minor, right? But now the D has gone up at the octave, making this chord, F, A, D. So now it's clear that D is the root of this chord, because in the root position, in the simplest form, D is in the bass. Therefore, we are certain that D is the root of this chord. This is some kind of D minor chord. And we know that D in F major is what scale degree? Well, all we have to do is count backwards from F down to E and down to D. So we've gone 8, 7, 6. D is scale degree 6 in F major. So our Roman numeral is going to have a 6. It's going to be lower capital, so it's minor, and it's going to need a number indicating the inversion. Now let's take a look at the intervals above the bass. So the interval from F to A is a third, and the interval from F to D is a sixth. In other words, this is the inversion with the third in the bass, which is the first inversion. So we're going to have here D minor over F in the bass, or 6, 6. And that will say that this is the 6th chord in F major, D minor, when it's in its first inversion. So just to review, this is really important to remember. When the root is in the bass, that is the root position. When the third of the chord is in the bass, that is its first inversion. And when the fifth of the chord is in the bass, that is the second inversion. And there's only these 3 shapes: root position, first inversion, and second inversion. Here, we just have the 1 chord in root position, then the augmented 1 chord in root position, and then the 6th chord in its first inversion, which makes a very nice chord progression. F major, F augmented, and then D minor in first inversion, which allows this very smooth holding of F in the bass, holding of A as these 2 common tones that stay the same the entire time, and yet the harmony, as you can feel, the harmony is changing. So this is a really nice thing where we have only 1 note changing by half step, and yet the whole feeling of the piece, in other words, the whole harmonic motion underneath, shifts ever so slightly with each half step change in that upper note. And it's really nice when we finally reach that D minor chord with F in the bass. The tension created by the augmented chord resolves to D minor in first inversion. Okay, let's take 1 or 2 quick more examples. So this is an excerpt from the Grand Valse by Francisco Tárrega, later 19th century romantic guitar piece. This is just the very beginning. This has a similar kind of thing where the bottom notes are only changing slightly, the top notes are changing slightly, the middle notes are remaining the same, creating this smooth common tone, same A and C sharp that whole time, while the notes around them change and change the harmony ever so slightly. So let's just see how this sounds. This is in A major. Etc. But that's what we have here. The bass is going to be the most important thing for determining the inversions that are happening here. But first, we should recognize that the melody, in this case played on a guitar, so the melody and the bass are written all on one staff. E and F sharp and G sharp in the top line there are not always going to be necessary for this chord. Just like in the last excerpt, we didn't really even take into account the melody notes. And like I've said before, the melody has a tendency to weave in and out of the chords. And so really what we're paying attention to here are the middle voices and those and that lowest voice, the bass. What is the bass doing here in terms of inversion of this chord? Those middle notes and the bass notes are what we're paying attention to here. And if I make a quick reduction, it would look something like this. Now we have A, C sharp, and E, and then changes of the bass down to E, A, C sharp. And then back to A, C sharp, E, and then E, A, C sharp. So you can see that A and C sharp remain there in the middle, while these notes move around them. So that's a very simplified way of the spread out version. So now you may recognize that in the melody line in the first chord, we do have E, so that we have the full chord, A in the bass, A and C sharp in the middle, and then E in the melody. And then in the second measure, I've ignored the F sharp from the melody because that's not really part of this chord, which then is E, A, and C sharp. And then in the third measure, there's F sharp still, but I really think this comes back to the first chord, which is A, C sharp. But now we notice that E is missing. And this is something we're going to actually see a lot, is that it is sufficient to just have two notes in order to imply a triad. So even just A and C sharp, just having the root in third, it'll imply a fifth. In other words, imply a whole major triad. The F sharp is there as just kind of a floating melodic figure and is not crucial to the chord. So we'll just assume this is back to the one chord A, C sharp, E, when the E is implied by the other two notes. And then the last one, G sharp, is not really part of that chord. This is similar to the second chord. So if I apply Roman numerals to this, I get one chord in root position. Then I have the same chord, A, C sharp, E, but now E is in the bass. So this is the fifth in the bass, in other words, second inversion, which I'm going to call 1-6-4. And as you can see there, the 6 is from E to C sharp, and the 4th is from E to A. So you can see pretty clearly in even just the shape of the chord, those figured bass in those inversion numbers 6 and 4. Then the third chord is just back to the 1 in root position. Now I didn't write 1-5-3 as we saw earlier because we can just leave that out. Of course it's 1-5-3, it's in root position. Then with the fourth chord, this is again 1-6-4, second inversion. Now E, in other words the fifth of the chord, is in the bass. Root in the bass, root position. Third in the bass, first inversion. We don't have that here, but fifth in the bass, second inversion, and that happens twice here in this really common kind of 1-5-1 pattern, where the chord stays the same, but you have the bass notes. Lots of music includes these changes as a way of extending the one chord through different inversions, so that you don't get bored listening to the same chord over again because the inversions are changing, and the melody is very interesting here as well. So that's what our analysis of the Tárrega would look like. Okay, one more example. This is from Beethoven. So once again, when I'm analyzing the chords here, I'm really more interested in the left hand than in the right hand because the melody is going to mislead me sometimes, as I've said before. Not all of the notes in the melody are in the chords, but we can see the chords pretty clearly if we look closely at the left hand. They're running in triplets in the bass. So it starts on F here. So if I start to analyze these chords, make reductions one by one, once again, I'm first going to have to figure out the key, and then I'm going to place the Roman numerals on the lines, paying attention now to how some chords in this excerpt are inverted. So what is the key? Well, we have 4 flats here, B flat, E flat, A flat, and D flat. Now one trick with flats I've mentioned before in discovering the key is that the second to last flat is the key. So this could be A flat major, because that's the second to last flat, A flat, and that usually tells us that this is A flat major. But I want to double check because what is the first chord? The first chord, as I mentioned, is F, A flat, and C. So actually F is in the bass here. This is going to be actually F minor. And so in F minor, that first chord, F, A flat, C, is the 1 chord. and it's minor, so it's lowercase instead of capital this time. Then the second chord I would reduce like this: F, A flat, and then D flat. And I didn't have to do much work to reduce it because it looks just like it did in the left hand there: F, A flat, and D flat. Now this one is kind of like what we saw in the Clara Schumann example, because this is going from the one chord. Now we don't have the augmented one chord, but we go to the sixth chord in first inversion once again. So here we see that this is D flat, F, A flat. That would be the sixth chord in F minor. Now the D flat is up the octave. It's created a 6-3 interval pattern in the chord, meaning this is in first inversion, or 6-6. Now we're going to see a similar pattern as we keep going, because the next chord is G, B flat, D flat. Well, G in F minor is the second scale degree, so this is a 2 chord. And I notice that it's G and D flat, which means, it's not a perfect fifth. It's a diminished fifth from the outer voices G and D flat. So this is actually a diminished triad. It's minor, it's lowercase because it's even smaller than minor. It's crushed further, and so I put a little degree sign there for diminished. Remember, a plus sign for augmented, small degree sign there for a diminished triad. Now when D flat moves up to E flat, notice that G and B flat stay the same for the next chord, and D flat moves up to E flat. So right there, just once again, one note changes, and the harmony also shifts. We feel a different quality here. Now this, if we rearrange this chord, put the E flat down the octave, we get E flat, G, B flat, which is a major chord. So now we've gone from a diminished chord to a major chord in first inversion by just moving this one note. Okay, so if I write G, B flat, and E flat, I know that this is an E flat chord, which in the key of F is 7, F, and then E flat is just below it. That's scale degree 7. So this is going to be a major chord, E flat major, capital Roman numeral 7, in first inversion. So with the little 6 superscript. And we can see that it implies first inversion, of course, remember, is 6-3, and that's the arrangement of intervals we have here as well. G to B flat is a third, and G to E flat is a sixth. So the pattern continues, actually, because the next chord is the 3 chord, A flat major, and it's capital because it's major. Here we just have A flat, C, and E. A flat, C, and D flat. And then the next chord changes a little bit more. The bass note changes to A natural, and the top note changes to F natural. So now we have an interesting chord because this is A, C, F. Well, if I take the F down the octave, I get FAC, which is a major chord built on F. So this is actually the 1 chord, but now major and in first inversion, 6th. So this is going to be capital 1 in first inversion, 1-6. Now the A is made natural, so this is made into a major chord. The third is in the bass, A, but now it's made A natural, so it is 1-6. Now the root of this chord is B flat, as we can see pretty clearly, because this one's already in root position. This is B flat minor. Minor third and major third. And B flat in F minor is the 4th scale degree. This is the 4 chord, and it's minor. Then the next note that moves is this goes up to G. Okay, well actually you might recognize this. B flat, D flat, and G, because we've seen that before. We had that down here. The 3rd chord is the 2 diminished chord, G, B flat, and D flat. Then if we go B flat, D flat, G, like this, we can tell that that is just an inversion of that chord. So this final chord is 2 diminished again, but now in first inversion, in other words, 2 diminished 6. So overall, this creates kind of an interesting pattern he's made here, where every other chord goes 1, 2 diminished, 3, 4, and then the chords in between start on 6-6, then go 7-6, then go 1-6. And interestingly, as we note, that makes this scale in the bass line, F, F, G, G, A flat, A natural, B flat, B flat. The scale in the bass line is rising up. So that's our basic introduction to inversion. Just remembering that the important things to take away: the root is not always equal to the bass. When the root is in the bass, that's root position. When the third is in the bass, that's first inversion, which we label with a small 6. And when it's the fifth in the bass, that's the second inversion, which we label with a small 6/4. We could also use the chord names and say this is F minor over F, or F major over A, or something like that. And lastly, that the inversions change the quality of the chord ever so much. They keep the sound of C major. They retain something of the overall quality of that chord, whether it's F minor, C major, G diminished, or whatever it is. But they have slightly different qualities, slightly different feelings based on the different intervals that are contained with them. And I think it's really helpful to know those so that we can use them in cool different ways. Like, for example, here, where the bass line is just moving up by step, but over top, the harmony is shifting back and forth all the time. Similar in the previous examples where the bass line even stayed the same. In the Clara Schumann, the bass was the same and only one note moved by half step, and yet the harmony shifts. And this is due and thanks to inversion.